Great. Thank you so much. And everybody can hear me okay, I think. So it seems like from a conversation with Leonore just to start with. But just thank you so much for the invitation to come and talk to perfect. Thanks for the thumbs up to the AgBioData community. I just completed this rapid study on database sustainability given the upheaval we've all been experiencing with the federal funding landscape this year. And this is actually my first presentation on it. So I can't think of a better group of people to really bring this to and to have a discussion about what the data resources are facing at this point in time. My basic plan was just to walk through the study itself, a bit of the context, backgrounds, methods, and then a bit on what the results were, and then the impacts and some implications for where we are today. I'll end with a prompting question for discussion, but yeah, please feel free to put questions in the chat, and that discussion could go any way that would be useful to those of you who've come to listen today. So my hope is it's a good use of your time. Well, it's always precious. So just getting started then with some background on the context and methods. This isn't going to be surprising to anybody, I think, on this call that database sustainability is just a very old problem. So there's this short, really interesting paper, actually in 1998, in Nature Biotechnology that looked at 400 biological databases that were available on the web at that time, and the majority of them already were facing financial instability. So it's been an old and quite intractable problem for quite some time now. So the new problems, of course, is that we just really haven't seen this kind of widespread, abrupt, and dramatic decrease in the support for science as a whole, in lots and lots of different ways. I won't belabor that. You're all very aware of it. I'm thinking about funding in particular. So research grants that have been, outright pulled, but also the reduced calls for grant applications, so less opportunity to even compete for within the grant pool, as well as the changes in or the expected changes and attempts at attempted changes for indirect cost recovery, so for the facilities and administrations that organizations use in order to cover the overhead costs for doing research on in and of itself. So it's quite a perfect storm of a funding scenario that this spring then really made me wonder, well, how are these resources going to weather this? So just a little bit about where I'm coming from myself. So I'm a biochemist by training, and as part of that, I was, a huge user of open data resource, GenBank, PDB, Uniprot, Brenda, all those sorts of things. And then also by virtue of the work that I did, also, created and deposited. So both a user and a producer of data sources. And then about a year ago, I moved to my position at the university library, where I manage a group that helps researchers all across campus, so from any kind of discipline, manage and share their data openly. And one of the things that happened really early on then is that people would come and they would be really enthusiastic and they'd want to start their own open data resource. And, perfect thought. We love the emphasis and the desire to do data sharing. But I already had known by then that sustainability was a real issue. So that was a difficult conversation to have with people to try to make them aware of what they would be getting themselves into. But then the flip side of that is because people would also come to us and they had already established a resource and they lost funding, or they lost a key developer, or were just honestly just sick of managing it. And so they didn't want to do it anymore. And so they try to just hand it over. But of course, we don't have the resources for that either, just to do it for any resource. So I really started to think that what I needed myself was just a better grounding in where we are with sustainability of these sorts of resources. So I started doing, a series of different research projects on it. So I won't go into any detail, but this is basically kind of how it framed my thinking for when it came this spring. But one of the first ones I did was on the database issue, which is published, each year at the beginning for nucleic acids research, very prominent issue. And looking at that, there were 100 new databases that were being, established every year. And that's absolutely a lower limit. There are editorial policies, peer review, quite specifically aimed at molecular biology as a whole. So this is, just a tiny sliver, honestly, but that's still 100 resources that, theoretically somebody has established with the idea of being able to maintain it for the long term. I followed that up with looking at how the longest lived of those resources had managed to basically sustain themselves over, the long term. And long term, I am calling for a digital resource is at least 15 years. That's several grant cycles. That's usually many technology refreshes. There's a lot to keeping a resource afloat. But not surprisingly, there, one of the outcomes was just, the data that really showed the US government has played a massive role in funding and hosting open databases. So already knowing that, and then I had worked with the Global BioData Coalition to really try to get a handle on basically the scope of the digital infrastructure overall, trying to find all of the data resources that exist. And so we did a largely automated pipeline to be able to identify resources that were in the biomedical literature. So, and from that, we could really show just how large and distributed this was. So that means the sustainability, even though we talk about it, kind of like in little pockets, it's really quite a widespread problem. So when it came to spring then, and I started to, consider what would happen, it seemed like this was an important moment to try to capture how data resources were reacting, what their strategies were, what they were facing. So the research object or the objective was just to look at the vulnerability of long-lived databases amid this funding crisis. The criteria that I used for database selection had to be available for a minimum of 15 years, based in the US, since this is where our current crisis is, with a life science focus, and have received funding from a US federal agency at some point. At this period, I didn't know who may or may not have had funding or funding paused, or that data is not always exactly evident. And I was using the idea of, again, looking at the longer lived resources as evidence of that there's utility. Like, this doesn't happen by accidents, that something manages to stick around for this long. So someone was paying attention, someone cares. It's certainly useful to someone. The methodology for this is a social science mixed method qualitative study. Specifically, it's called a multiple mini case study. I really wanted to try to do something that looked at a range of different types of databases and on a pretty rapid timescale, given the urgency of the issue. So what I did then was I did interviews with database representatives, and then I gathered as much documentation as I could pull in the form of different articles or reports that are available, but also the websites themselves. So histories and about pages and all those sorts of things. So you pull all that together. I'll have a slide in a little bit just showing what that methodology actually looks like in practice, since it might not be as familiar. There are, of course, limitations to try to do something on this time scale. So the depth isn't as deep as would be for a normal case study, which usually goes over years, and it includes thousands of actual documents that are reviewed. And we'll often have multiple authors so that you can have that kind of internal verification of what your finding is too. And then generalizability would also be limited here in terms of databases that are newer, who haven't had as much practice actually having to weather some kinds of ups and downs of the funding environment, but also resources that are either not in the life sciences or not based in the US. So in the end, I was able to profile 9 very diverse databases that all have a life science focus. So, and that diversity was really intentional. So there's certainly databases that are really core and they serve huge swaths of users. VEuPath actually is an example of one that has tens of thousands of users, but that isn't actually indicative of the entire ecosystem. The ecosystem is also made up of little tiny resources that serve quite small communities with very specific functions. So I was looking to try to get across both the scale and the scope of the different types of resources that were out there, as well as the different kinds of data. So, for example, the Biodiversity Heritage Library is actually literature, and data is extracted from that literature, versus worm-based, which is actually images of nematodes. So this is electron micrograph imagery. So initially, I was aiming for 10. I did have a 10th, but unfortunately, they did pull out, just citing the concerns with uncertainty around funding. And two resources did elect to remain anonymous for this. And I do, this is speculation, but I honestly don't think this would have happened a year ago. So that itself seems to be indicative of this period of time where there's been just an enormous amount of uncertainty and just concern about everything. So to go into the specific databases that I looked into a little bit more detail, so you have some grounding about what I'm finding. So BHL, so Biodiversity Heritage Library, as I said, is archival and contemporary literature, but also has some things like field notes and data is extracted to that to look at historical trends, taxonomy verification, et cetera. MorphoBank, Tanya and I saw Brooke is on here as well. So those are phylogenetic matrices so that you can compare features and characteristics in a nice controlled way, and that's especially useful for comparative studies. OMIM, which is the Online Mendelian Inheritance in Man. It was actually very old, started, in print in the 60s, went online in the mid 90s. And that actually is sourced from external data sources already, but pulls, I think, over 24 different sources together to do these authoritative reviews and summaries of genes and phenotypes. So that's used as especially for kind of a first stop for exploration of genes and genetic disorders. ORDB is an example of a much more niche resource. So that's looking at olfactor chemoreceptors and their protein sequences. So for the study of those particular class of proteins, but also interesting, has these crosswalks of nomenclatures that were used between different labs who did a lot of work in this area. rrnDB is the ribosomal RNA copy number database. So that has 16 and 23S gene sequences. Taxonomies, especially because it's important for studying microbial populations to know these populations at the genus level rather at the variant level, which is what you get from gene sequence, obviously. So this actually ends up being really important for things like studying the gut microbiota. And VEuPath, fascinating history there. It's actually a conglomeration of, I think it's 13 distinct databases at this point, all having to do with pathogenicity. So lots of individual organism databases like PlasmoDB for Plasmodium, all working on the same infrastructure. And they actually pull in lots of different types of data as well. So considered a multi-omics resource, but as well, basically that forms a centralized access for looking into different diseases. And then WormAtlas, as I said, is actually really highly detailed, highly annotated and microscopy images that are used particularly in developmental biology, neurobiology, and for the study of anatomy. So that's the truest model organism database that's on this list here. The last two databases, obviously, because they wanted to remain anonymous, I can't say too much about, but they are in that biomedical relevance with relation to human health. So squarely in line with other resources that are talked about here. So the way this works is that basically each database forms a case. And so what I do then is I had the interviews, I had all these other documents, I had the web pages. And so you pull those together for each database as its case. And the method basically is you go over thing and really close reading and fine-tooth comb, and you start to annotate. So basically to highlight different concepts that are important for your ultimate research question. They're going to be important for how you interpret that then. And so you go through that repeatedly and iteratively to try to make sense of things. And in particular for me, I was trying to be able to understand how I could compare across these sorts of resources. So you do the sort of coding, you use the software program that allows you to basically track those codes, count them up, refine them, and also track them across all of your cases so you could see, what was similar between the resources and what was a bit different. So talking then about the results, and I'll just kind of give a few key highlights here. The first one really is, despite how wildly different these resources are, the purpose is also rooted really in efficiency. So the idea for all of them is really to make data that's scattered, either throughout the literature or throughout other data resources, or otherwise inaccessible at all because they're still, residing with the researcher who created them to begin with, to make pull that data together to make it discoverable and also fit for purpose. And so that concept ends up being really important here because the fit for purpose means that it's reliable. So there's curation, there's quality control on it being reliable, and also it's relevant to that community and the kinds of questions that those research communities are asking. So that makes it is really where that power is in terms of the efficiency, because ultimately these reduces effort. So people aren't having to go track all this information down on themselves, trying to do their own annotations, trying to make sense of it, individually, which we know would be certainly not nearly as comprehensive and a lot more labor intensive. So it allows basically the research enterprise then to capitalize on those past investments and then also supports, just comparative and larger studies to ultimately make research quicker. I did want to note too, like the thing that kept really coming out so strongly in this is that, we talk about them as databases and data resources, and obviously the data is fundamental, no data resource. But they really end up being just as much an expertise resource as a data resource, because that's where actually all the power and all the utility comes in. Those expert annotations, that expert curation in terms of deciding what data should belong, what kind of process it should be done to belong into the database, how it can be presented and searched and queried specifically to those research questions. So that expertise, that subject matter expertise or domain expertise is just really something that should be really at the forefront of when we think about these resources as a whole. So I think something that people on this call are also gonna resonate with. So looking at how these are supported then, this is difficult to tease apart, and this is well known to be difficult to tease apart because there's usually a lot of different sorts of inputs for making a resource sustainable. So in this way, I broke it out in kind of two broad categories, and then there's subcategories within it that I'll go into in a few slides. But first, there's direct monetary support. And so I called that funds that were explicitly given to the resource, like end up in an account specifically for the work of operating the resource. It wasn't a side project, wasn't like, oh, I guess we'll, do a little bit this year. It's like money that was really given to the resource to do its work. Then there's a whole slew of things that are basically non-monetary supports. So there's always, some sort of a monetary, kind of component to it underneath, but ultimately what it comes in the form is access to resources. So it could be access to IT services or expertise. I'll say more in a few minutes. And generally, this came about for these 9 in particular from either the database's host organization itself, or distributed among the resources community. So going into, I did want to have this sidebar on funding models because I thought this might be especially of interest to this group. There's, several different kind of papers and work that's out there already. I just wanted to share 2 that I think are really, really great and have certainly informed my own thinking, as I've gone through this. So I think the best overview is an OECD white paper that was published in 2008 on business models for sustainable research data repositories. I think it's particularly good because it's very clear-eyed and bases a lot of things in economic reality, while still being attuned to, the tenets of open data and not being too jargony. So it's quite digestible. And then there's a fabulous in-depth case study that was done by Eschenfelder and colleagues on social science data repositories. So they looked at 4 different repositories and databases and looked at them long term, so well before the internet age even. So, and they dug through thousands and thousands of documents and records, and so they could track really what their financial path looked like over decades. And so that's a really, really fabulous piece of work. So if you're interested in this area at all, these are 2 really great resources to start with, in my opinion. Okay, so for the 9 databases that I covered then, the direct monetary support came about in 4 different flavors. So not surprisingly, the most normative thing across all of these resources is grants and contracts. So from federal funding agencies, but also some from private foundations, et cetera. So then we all know that these are time limited and then, are required to align with funder priorities, which has been historically a challenge and then obviously continues to be. Another example then is membership fees. So BHL and MorphoBank are both examples of this, but then I'd also mention Dryad for anybody who's familiar with that as well. A membership fee is generally considered kind of a deposit side sort of sort of a scenario by OECD, although not necessarily, but more so it's considered kind of more of a social construct in terms of people want to join in order to support a community. But usually there are benefits that come with that support. So such as governance roles in terms of what direction the database might be going. And then often there'll be some sort of deposit advantage too. So the ability to deposit for free or at least at a reduced cost, something like that on behalf of a whole organization. The next one is subscription. So that's generally considered more transactional. You have money, I have data, we're going to switch. And this is the route that VEuPath is heading down now and TARE. So just talking with Leonora about that. So that in general needs a higher incentive to pay for specific goods and services, particularly in our area. There's usually some baseline access to some amount of data, but then further access or further features we usually require that subscription. The last then is donations. So that can come in the terms of fund drives, which we're all quite familiar with. The most common one among this set of 9 were the passive call to action buttons. So a donate button somewhere on a web page. So this requires goodwill. So, and is generally based on individuals donating. And for all the resources that, had some amount of donations, they were extraordinarily grateful for them, but it was also very clear, and OECD says this as well, that it's just not particularly viable for covering all the costs that require sustainability, especially over the long term, because it can fluctuate. In terms of the non-monetary supports, those are broken down into host support and distributed support. I will just say it gets a little murky here. Host support also can be a direct monetary support. For example, if someone was able to get an institutional grant that actually directly supported it. But in general, for these resources, and in general, when we're talking about it, we think more about the kind of less tangible sorts of supports that come with it. For example, fiscal sponsorship. So that's having a business office or a grants office that is able to just process, those sorts of dollars coming in to begin with. So usually the resources aren't charged for using those, but it's part of being a host institution. But also other benefits include, access to shared IT resources. So, that could be VMs or cloud provisioning, those sorts of things. And certainly as well, some way to be able to tap into shared staffing. So, partial development or developer support or some other, sometimes like communication staff, et cetera. That is dependent then on local capacity and the resources that are available, which can also fluctuate at different institutions. And so that's something that we're certainly aware of at this moment in time as well. And then finally, the one that is kind of the most amorphous or the most invisible is really the sort of distributed support. And many of the interviewees that I spoke with were really great about acknowledging how essential this was to their repository, in particular, the people who are creating the data, managing it, and then ultimately depositing it so that the resource and the science could exist at all. So that's certainly an important part of that. Shouldn't go unacknowledged, as well as volunteer service. So the willingness of people to serve on advisory boards and working groups, or to host, community events, or be champions for certain resources. And the requirement here is really the good overall health of the community. So is there the capacity and the will within the community to be able to provide those kinds of supports. In terms of the impacts that people were anticipating and some of the strategies, so getting a bit towards the end here. So what I was really aiming towards here, so all the interviews were done in the summer. So most of these came from what I heard from interviews about an example where VEuPath had already lost a significant amount of funding. So they had a very comprehensive user survey that asked about what would the impact would be if VEuPath went away. So that was also a really great source of information there. But across the board, like the most prevalent impact would really be higher barriers to do good research and higher barriers for the research, particularly in terms of access to this fit for purpose data. So the idea that without these resources there, people would have to resort to going back to the literature and looking at figures or trying to find supplemental files or, God forbid, trying to contact somebody to get the data actually out of them. So ultimately what you have is basically a reintroduction of more inefficient and fragmented research, which is, what these resources were established to fight against to begin with. And then, really I think the thing that gave, a lot of the database providers the most pause is really this loss of subject matter expertise. So this incredible amount of deep expertise that goes into what data to select, how to process it, what kinds of annotations, what their user community needs, how to answer those questions, et cetera, et cetera. Because ultimately the loss of expertise, it was really quite palpable because you might be able to get your infrastructure, your technology, or VM to limp along for a while, but people really do need to be paid, and that expertise is fragile in that sort of a way, and ultimately it will impact the quality of the data that's represented in the resource, and then ultimately impacts the quality of the research that can be done in that specific area, how things are interpreted fully with nuance and quite comprehensively. And a couple of the participants really pointed out, what that ultimate impact on scientific training would be as well, is not having these resources to nucleate all of that expertise into one place and make it so readily accessible, without having to, again, read, thousands of papers on their own. And so that impact it also had a cascading effect on the future generations of scientists. There's also, no surprise here either, anticipated interruption to innovation. So I think for all of you, you're probably very aware, you're always wanting to make improvements into a data resource. And so, they were expecting stalled infrastructure upgrades, whether it be, revising workflows for deposit or upgrading interfaces, web pages, but also the adoption of tools that would help people be more productive, different sorts of AI technologies that still require an enormous amount of subject matter expertise, but could maybe be used to leverage the resource a lot better and help make their own work more efficient. So one of the things that happened, so this was, I did these interviews in the summer, but you could already see that there were current impacts. I would been mostly thinking about, in the future, but resources had already experienced cuts. They had also already experienced delays, so they weren't sure if they were being cut. And there were also knock-on effects where they still had maybe their grant funding and expected that to last for a few years. But, in one example, somebody had access to a developer who was actually paid 50% on a different grant that was cut, therefore basically undermining the viability of having access to that developer at all. And so I think by and large the vast majority of the providers were already looking to alternatives, had their eyes wide open when we're looking at their horizons in terms of what are we going to do if these sorts of things happen. So getting into some of those strategies then, and the sustainability as it looks like today. And I'll start with some bad news and then I'll get into something that is hopefully more optimistic. But when you go back and you read the papers and even the OECD paper, but other ones, there was always an assumption that government support would be there. It was really just whether or not the data infrastructure itself could get a piece of it. So that was really the tension there, is being able to argue for sustainable funding from these the government agencies. But that's where we're seeing, there's a different state today where the whole thing has become quite shaky. And I should say too, it's not only in the US. So UK, EU has also seen some stumbling in terms of research support, and especially for basic science. So all of the resources, we're well aware that the diversification of funding sources would be a good idea. And now it's just become more imperative. And so they've been more aggressive about thinking about moving towards that. Also being aware, though, that philanthropies are being slammed because everybody's concerned about if they're going to be able to maintain their research area, and the same thinking about industry funders and who is or is not likely to be able to be interested in your resource or fund your resource, and what kinds of implications there are for that. Also being aware of, the universities in particular then have tightening budgets from a lot of different directions. And so ultimately that impacts host support. So, already recognizing that there is less stopgap funding necessarily available. And, it did come up too, and I can corroborate this as well, is like this also does impact the viability of organizational level memberships and subscriptions. So I think that this is a good thing to be aware of. I'm in a library, our budget constantly goes down, it never goes up. And the way that indirect cost distribution works, it goes, various ways across a university. And so I think a lot of places will be expecting to see just a decrease in their budgets. So that's also bad news. So in the short term, then, for sure, I think this ends up being as much about durability of and cushion in operations. When you look at these resources, they have been able to stay around for a long time, and a lot of that had to do with like how durable like their code bases were, how much kind of cushion they had in their support, those sorts of things. So I think that has always been something that the resources have had to weather, and now it just becomes a bit more heightened. So to end with my more positive kind of thoughts on this is, we are all extraordinarily aware of like what a data hungry world we're living in right now. Everybody wants the data, wants the data. They want it very easily and quickly. But I think very soon there will be a pivot to understanding, and some people do already, to be clear. But we'll get to this point where that be very expertise hungry. And I think about that in particular with science, where very minute details make all the difference, in the world. And it's life sciences in particular is just wildly messy. So that expertise is absolutely necessary. And I think that this is going to be important in terms of how other resources ultimately will be able to sustain themselves, or I have to hope so. But it does bring up some challenges in terms of like how do you negotiate those relationships, and what does that look like, and what does it look like for access to other people? So just a few key takeaways then in conclusion. So none of this is going to surprise this audience either, but just acknowledging that the importance of databases in particular, they're just essential for research efficiency, cohesion, and also have this prominent role in education that I'd say me going in hadn't thought about quite as strongly as really came out from the study for me anyway. Certainly the instability is causing a crisis for sustainability, which was already in crisis, as we knew. But ultimately, this really risks the practical utility and the ability to use and make the most of the data. And this especially comes out, through loss of expertise and having that center of expertise within these resources. So ultimately, it reinforces, bold, underlines, flashes this continued need for long-term strategies. So this is something that the Global BioData Coalition has been trying to do, to pull together, funders, research funders, worldwide in order to come up with better strategies to address these issues as a whole. Not every resource is going to be able to survive. That's like very, very clear. There's a lot of them. They have proliferated, but there should be a better strategy here that could be done to at least balance some things out. Ultimately, though, part of that is balancing open access and the financial realities. And so I was just going to end with, I pose this question. So the open data mantra is as open as possible, but as close as necessary, thinking about things like IP and, human subjects and that sort of thing. But we've seen this already. And so it seems like it's another wave of thinking about this as closed as self-sustaining requires. And I think we all flinch at this idea of self-sustaining, one, because it's an enormous amount of overhead, and it can very much change. Lenore and I were talking about this just a little bit, going to absolutely change kind of the mission and a lot of the work of maintaining the resource itself, but also what the implications are then for having, access, which also ultimately is the opportunity for the data to make the most good and to be used by anybody and to really move the whole field forward. So just understanding that's a tricky question. So I thought that might be a good thing to close on in terms of questions. So
thank you, Heidi.
Yeah, that was my end.
I'm going to stop the recording now so that people
Sure.
can, freely ask questions.